Hi, thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. This is the 10th lesson in a series of lessons on the book of Jude. In this lesson, I'm going to look at verse 7. In the very first lesson, I talked about why Jude was written and why it's in the Bible. Essentially, Jude recognized that people had crept into the church who were distorting grace and denying Jesus. He wrote to refute those issues. Now, for the purposes of this series of lessons, I've divided Jude into 5 sections. The first section is the introduction. The second section reminds us that Jesus is also a judge. In the third section, Jude described the problem he was addressing. In the fourth section, Jude wrote how Christians should respond to this problem. And then the fifth section is the conclusion. In this lesson, I'm looking at verse 7, which is part of the second section, reminding us that Jesus is also a judge. Now, before we get into that, let's talk about why Jude reminded us that Jesus is also a judge. If you remember in Jude 4, Jude wrote why he wrote his book. And he pointed out that certain people crept in secretly into the church, and one of the things they were doing was turning the grace of God into sensuality, and he wrote to refute that. The way he refuted that was to point out that Jesus is also a judge. Therefore, we can't take advantage of grace because there are still consequences for sin. The way Jude did that is he referred to 3 things from the Old Testament. He talked about the Exodus, he talked about angels, and he talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. In this lesson, we're looking at verse 7, which is where Jude mentioned Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's start reading at verse 3. Verse 3 and 4 tell us why Jude wrote the book, and then we'll look at verses 5, 6, and 7. Jude 3. Beloveds, making every effort to write to you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, urging you to contend for the faith which has been delivered over once for all to the saints. For certain people crept in secretly, those who were long ago designated into this judgment, ungodly people, turning the grace of God into sensuality and denying our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Now I want to remind you, you who know all things once for all, that Jesus, having saved a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. And angels, the ones not keeping their own realm, but having left their own dwelling, he kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities around them, having committed sexual sins in similar manner as these, and having departed after strange flesh, undergoing punishment, are exhibited as an example of eternal fire. We see here in Jude 7 that Jude referred to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them. So before we dissect Jude 7, let's go back to the book of Genesis and refresh our memories on Sodom and Gomorrah. The first time we see a mention of Sodom and Gomorrah is Genesis 10, verse 19. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, as you go toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim as far as Lasha. So this chapter is a description of a geographical territory, and it uses Sodom and Gomorrah as markers to define that territory. Then we see a reference to Sodom again in Genesis chapter 13. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. So we see that Lot settled in Sodom. We also see that Sodom was very wicked, and that's important to know later on. Then we see Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned in Genesis 14. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim. So Genesis 14 tells us about a battle between Sodom and Gomorrah and some other kings from that area against some kings from over in the Mesopotamian valley. During that battle, Lot and his family and his possessions were captured, and Abraham found out about it. He led some of his armed men out, and they freed Lot and his family and his possession. And that brings us to chapter 18. This is verse 1. Now the Lord appeared to Abram by the oaks of Mamre, while he was sitting at the tent door in the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. So Abraham has these visitors, and one of them is the Lord. And we read this in verse 9. The men said to Abram, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "There in the tent." He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah your wife will have a son." Up to this point, Sarah had been barren, and at this point, the Lord is telling Abram that Sarah is going to bear a son. Then later, we see this in verse 16. Then the men rose up from there and looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham was walking with them to send them off. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And then later, the Lord says this, "And the Lord said, The outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave." So we see that Sodom and Gomorrah were very sinful. And then we read this in verse 22. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom. While Abraham was still standing before the Lord, Abraham came near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" In the following verses, Abraham negotiated with the Lord, trying to reduce the number of men it would take, or the number of righteous men it would take, for the Lord to not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham knew that Lot was living in Sodom, and Abraham was trying to protect Lot. Then that brings us to chapter 19. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And then these men went with Lot to Lot's house. Then we read this in verse 4. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, and they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them." So here we see the wickedness of Sodom coming out. What we read in the following verses is about this conflict between Lot and the angels inside Lot's house and the men outside. Then later we read this. Then the two men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? A son-in-law, and your sons and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord, that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So here we see stated very clearly that these men are going to destroy Sodom. Then we go forward to verse 23. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife, from behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So we see here the Lord did indeed destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. Notice it also says all the valley. It wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah that were destroyed, but other cities in this valley were also wicked, and they were also destroyed. Now, with that as some refresher, let's go back to Jude 7. Now remember in Jude is refuting the idea that we can turn grace into sensuality or turn grace into licentiousness. And the way Jude refuted that was he talked about the Lord destroying some of the Israelites after he brought them out of Egypt. He also talked about angels who were held for the day of judgment. And then in verse 7, he's referring back to Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them. Now if you take this verse and look at just the main idea, we see this. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah, undergoing punishment, are exhibited as an example of eternal fire. So remember, Jude wrote Jude to refute the idea that we can turn grace into sensuality or turn grace into licentiousness. One of the ways he did this was to refer back to Sodom and Gomorrah and point out that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because of their sin, and that's an example to us of eternal fire. It teaches us that God is not only full of grace, he is also a judge. He also punishes sin. That means there are consequences for sin. And so we should not abuse grace. We should not turn grace into sensuality or licentiousness because there are consequences for sin. We also see this phrase, having committed sexual sins. That gives us more information about the sins that Sodom and Gomorrah were committing that led to their destruction. We also see that they departed after strange flesh. Again, that's more information about the sins that Sodom and Gomorrah committed. And so now if we look at those lines, we see, just as Sodom and Gomorrah, having committed sexual sins and having departed after strange flesh, undergoing punishment, are exhibited as an example of eternal fire. So again, Jude wrote this to refute the idea that we can turn grace into sensuality or licentiousness. Sodom and Gomorrah committed sexual sins. They departed after strange flesh. They were destroyed by God, teaching us that God punishes sin. There are consequences for sin, and so we should not abuse grace. We also see this phrase, and the cities around them. Jude pointed out that it wasn't just Sodom and Gomorrah. There was also other cities around them that were destroyed. And then we have this phrase, in similar manner as these. That raises the question, what does the word these refer to? Now, if you look at the number and gender of this particular Greek word and start tracing back, I believe that word refers to the angels from verse 6. Remember, there were angels who did not keep their own realm, they left their own dwelling, and they are being kept in eternal bonds for the judgment of the great day. And then Jude stated that Sodom and Gomorrah in similar manner, so in similar manner as the angels, Sodom and Gomorrah, having committed sexual sins and having departed after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example of eternal fire. Now let's focus on that last phrase, an example of eternal fire. And I'll just repeat what I said a little bit ago. Sodom and Gomorrah are an example for us. They were punished for their sins. They were destroyed for their sins. And the lesson for us is that God is not only full of grace, He is also a judge. He punishes sin. And so Jude wants us to understand that there are consequences for sin in our lives. And so yes, God is full of grace. He has extended great grace to us. But that does not mean there are no consequences for sin. That does not give us the freedom to live our lives however we want to. We still have to be very aware of sin, and we have to do everything within our power to avoid sin, because there are consequences for sin. And the reason Jude wrote all this is he was trying to refute those who had secretly crept into the church, who were turning the grace of God into sensuality. These people were abusing God's grace. They had this idea that since God is full of grace, then we can engage in sensuality and there are no consequences for that. But Jude pointed out that is wrong, and he used Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of the fact that God is also a judge and He does punish sin. And we should live our lives accordingly. Thanks for visiting Bible Mountain. If you've already joined my email list, thank you, and please forward this to someone else who would benefit from visiting Bible Mountain. If you have not joined my email list yet, please do so now. This is the best way to make sure you receive all my content. My email list is free. In order to sign up, go to BibleMountain.com, click on email, and that will take you to a page where you can sign up. Your email address will not be sold nor given away. Once again, thank you for visiting Bible Mountain.